little anecdote about my experience reading Marx. I spent a lot of time, of course, with the basic texts. I don't read German. I have to rely very much on the English versions of Capital. And volumes 2 and 3 were effectively created by Engels out of Marx's notebooks. And of course, Engels being very, very close to Marx, he assumed he was really trying to do as well as he could with Marx's original texts and turn them into something interesting and significant. In volume 3, the materials are very much divided up into relatively small chapters. It seems that Engels, before Marx died, had almost no access to what Marx had been writing, and Marx seems not to have told Engels anything about what he had in mind. So Engels, in a sense, after he died, just found the manuscripts and had to start from what he found, and did his best. In recent times, the manuscripts themselves have been published, so we can go back and look at what Engels did and look at what the original manuscripts are like, and we find that Engels did, in some instances, make some alterations in Marx, so that some of the scholars working on the publication of the manuscripts, some of them started to say we should cease to call volume 2 and 3 works by Marx, we should call them works by Engels. And Engels came in for some pretty hard criticism about 10 years ago because he had plainly favored certain interpretations over others. In one notorious instance, in the chapters on the falling rate of profit, Marx had pointed out situations where the profit rate could rise. Engels then added, but in the long run we know it must fall, which is a pretty big thing to add when Marx is talking about, there are situations where it rises. So now, however, the volume 3 is available in manuscript form, and this is the English version in manuscript form. It's very thick and all the rest of it. And one of the things that happens is that you find yourself reading in a very, very different way, because all of the chapter headings, which are currently in volume 3, were created by Engels. Engels only had one chapter on the falling rate of profit, and Engels divided it into 3: the law of the falling rate of profit, countervailing influences and contradictions of the law. But Marx's manuscript just flows on, and when you read it, you recognize that was Marx really so interested in the falling rate of profit, or was he actually interested in using his thinking about the falling rate of profit to explore all sorts of other aspects and dynamics which were occurring in a capitalist society. And one of the things that Engels' chapter headings tend to do is to give you a sense that Marx was very close to creating a finished manuscript. When you're reading the notes, it doesn't look like a finished manuscript at all. It looks like somebody who's exploring things. And those of you who are familiar with the Grundrisse will know that Marx in exploratory mode can get into all kinds of things and start, wandering this way and that way. So all of the stuff on interest-bearing capital is in one chapter, chapter 5 of the notebooks. Whereas in Marx's Capital, as edited by Engels, there are about 15 chapters, all divided up into very short things. And in effect, what this does is to say to you that Marx had a very deep concern with what the title of what his chapter 5 was about, which is the division of profit into interest and profit of enterprise. And furthermore, he's going to be talking about interest-bearing capital. Now, when Marx uses a phrase like that, it means that there's a distinctive form of capital that is not the same as other forms. So Marx will talk about the circulation of fixed capital, a distinctive form of circulation. So Marx is talking here about a distinctive form of circulation, which is not the same as the general form of circulation that he's been looking at, and he wants to have a detailed way of understanding it. And so chapter 5 here is some nearly 300 pages long. This is a very long chapter, so this is not just a small piece of Marx's argument. This is a pretty hefty investigation he's undertaking. Okay, a lot of it is just copying down figures out of parliamentary reports, so there are pages and pages of figures, but nevertheless there's a lot of substantive discussion of ideas and everything, and it's not complete. It wanders all over the place, but it is about what Marx clearly saw as a distinctive form of capital circulation, and not only distinctive but vital to understand, because this is, if you like, as he various points says things like, this is where capital in general, this is the form of circulation that represents capital in general. This is the form of circulation which is going to tie together almost everything that has to be tied together. And therefore there is a distinctive relation, when I'm reading this time, a much closer relation with some of the open questions that were there in Volume 2. Now, last time we talked a little bit about Marx's content of Volume 2, and Volume 2 is sort of about circulation of fixed capitals and differential turnover times. And one of the things that happens here is that when you start to look at these forms of circulation, you realize that in order for capital to keep circulating, there has to be a vast amount of hoarding by capitalists. For example, if somebody buys a machine for $1 million and it's going to last 10 years, then the value of that machine, which you bought for $1 million day one, has to be recuperated over the 10 years, which means that you're going to have $100,000 the first year, $200,000 the third, and when you replace it in the 10th year, you're going to end up with $1 million. So over all of that time, you're going to have to take all of that money and stick it under a mattress or stick it in a safe or something like that. And when you do that, you're killing the motion of capital. So Marx says this is dead capital. Hoarding capital that way, it's not moving, it's not doing anything, it's just sitting in the safe. But the capitalist has to hold on to it, because when you get to the 10th year and you need to spend another $1 million on buying a machine, you've got to have the $1 million ready to go. So Marx talks about this and kind of says, well, actually, as capital gets more and more complicated and it uses more and more fixed capital and things like that, you would need more and more hoarding. In fact, so much value would have to be hoarded that there would be almost none left for circulation. And hoarded capital, being dead capital or anti-capital as I call it, hoarded capital is no good to anybody. Marx has various words for it: dead capital, fallow capital, devalued capital until it's revalued by coming back into circulation. Now, the obvious solution to this problem is, as the capitalist gets more money, they take the spare money and they put it in a savings institution and they get some interest on it so somebody can use it elsewhere. So the credit system can do it that way, or instead of buying the machine, you simply borrow the $1 million at the outset and you pay back, over the 10 years. I mean, in other words, the introduction of the credit system solves all of these difficulties. And that therefore a complicated capitalist society could not under any circumstances continue without the creation of a sophisticated credit system. And it releases vast amounts of value so that value can be used and deployed. So that's what the credit system has to be about. So interest-bearing capital is going to be circulation of capital along these lines, which, as I mentioned last time, also is homogenized in terms of its temporality, so that you can actually then have a functioning capitalist society, and everybody knows what the interest rate is, what they can borrow, and why, and all the rest of it. So there is item 1 that comes out of volume 2 is that there is no way that that system could continue without a sophisticated credit system. But then there comes something else in at the end of volume 2, which we didn't talk about last time, where Marx is talking about the way in which there is a relation between the production of wage goods and the production of means of production. And he kind of says, in a complicated society, the demand for wage goods is given by the total wage bill. The total wage bill is given by those workers who are working in the production of wage goods, but also those workers working in the production of means of production. So the demand is given by the employment of workers in the production of means of production and production of wage goods, and the supply is given by the total production of wage goods. They have to be in equilibrium, says Marx. If they're not in equilibrium, you've got a disequilibrium, and if they get really out of disequilibrium, you've got a crisis. So Marx talks then about what the relationship is between the production of means of production and the production of wage goods. And there has to be a particular kind of, he does what's called an input-output analysis to show that there has to be a coordination in the demand and supply of these in such a way that they match each other. Now this works very well all the time. You're looking at simple reproduction. But you've then got the problem of you're now producing wage goods and means of production, and you're taking them here, but you've got to have more value up here than at the bottom. Well, you've produced more value, but where does the demand come from which is going to realize the value? There's a real problem here. You know, where does it come from? Who's got it? And at that point, Marx actually kind of sees this as a problem and says, well, there are a couple of possibilities here. One is we could have a separate segment of society which is not producing means of production, but which is producing the money form. And that would be the gold producers. So Marx plays around with saying, well, maybe I could make this all work by introducing a sector called the gold producers, but he gives up on it after a bit and says, this can't work. He then says, and ends up with a thing saying, well, somebody has to have the surplus purchasing power to realize this surplus value. Who has it? Can the workers have it? No, of course not. The only people who can have it, in fact, is the bourgeoisie. So he then actually ends up with the crazy kind of thought that actually the realization of the value depends upon the bourgeoisie having enough surplus funds that they can actually purchase the surplus value, so that they are the ones who realize the value which they have organized in production. This is an insane kind of society. And Marx looks at it and says, but that's the only answer. And left it at that. He didn't get any further with the discussion, but it was all sort of very tentative. Along comes Rosa Luxemburg and looks at it and says, the gold producers are insane. The idea that the bourgeoisie is going to actually realize the value of the surplus value through, using their surpluses is also insane. So there has to be an outside source of demand. So Rosa Luxemburg says, where does that come from? It comes from trade with non-capitalist societies. It comes from imperialism, in short, and colonialism, and colonial occupation. And Rosa Luxemburg quotes a famous example. Well, okay, the British had the Indians grow opium to sell to China, and then the Chinese bought it with silver, and the silver came back to India, and then the silver came round and realized the value. And so in fact, it was extracting silver through imperialist practices that actually was stabilizing global capitalism. So Rosa Luxemburg says the extra demand has to come from outside, must come from outside. And the outside is going to be colonized, imperialized, and all the rest of it. And then Rosa Luxemburg says, well, that limits the life of capitalism. Because clearly when everything on the outside has been pillaged and taken and imperialized and colonized, then there's no outside. So the whole thing is going to collapse. So that was Rosa Luxemburg's theory of imperialism, basically. It was sort of talking about it in those kinds of ways. But then it turns out that actually, no, there is something else. And this is where this chapter on interest-bearing capital becomes crucial, because Marx starts to realize in the middle of this chapter that one of the ways in which you can solve this problem is through the creation of money, but not gold, of credit money. So in other words, the extra consumption and effective demand is going to be created in here by the banks and the financial institutions and the central banks and all the rest of it, what I end up calling the state finance nexus, produces credit monies which then flow around here as excess consumer effective demand over what is achieved simply by the distribution of that part of the value through this mechanism. In other words, you supplement this so that the extra demand then comes and is fueled by credit. But what is credit? A credit is a demand upon future labour. So in effect, what you're saying, what's created in here is fictitious capital. That is a capital which has not yet been realized, and you pump it into the system, and then the credit has to be redeemed, and the debt has to be repaid. But the only way you can repay the debt is, of course, by feeding more credit into this system. So the idea that somehow or other you can get rid of the national debt and never have any kind of credit society. So in Volume 3 of Capital, Marx gradually kind of comes to realize that not only is the credit system absolutely foundational for coordinating all these differential turnover times and releasing hoarded capital, which is a terribly, terribly important function, but there's another function too, which is the creation of credit monies, which are actually then going to, if you like, push this system. Now, what this says is that there are various forces at work which are impelling the circulation of capital. And we can look at those now in the following way. One force is the interest of the entrepreneur, individual capitalist, who gets the money, converts it into capital and is seeking profit. And that, in Volume 1, that's the kind of where the energy is coming from. The energy is coming entirely from there. In Volume 2, however, the energy is coming from there, but it also has to come from somewhere else, because there has to be sufficient realization of value for what is potential value to be realized in value, and that potentiality is given by consumer effective demand, by the structuring of wants, needs and desires and all the rest of it. So that in Volume 2 you start to see another source of impelling things, which is a growing demand, which is pushing very hard and demanding that the entrepreneurs enter in and supply something. So wants, needs and desires don't have to wait upon capital, they can occur anyway. I mean, people are hungry, so yeah, we want more food. Yeah, we want transport, we want adequate transport, we want adequate housing, whatever. So demands can come from there, and there have to be responses down here. So part of the energy of the system is actually located up here, but there's not enough consumer demand in and of itself without the creation of another center of energy, which is the creation of interest-bearing capital and the circulation of interest-bearing capital. And the circulation of interest-bearing capital has two paths. One is it goes through here and becomes money capital. The other is that interest-bearing capital can actually circulate by supplementing wages. You give credit cards, for example, to the workers, or it can be supplemented by bourgeois demand, or of course it can supplement it by state expenditures. That is, you increase the national debt. Right? So it turns out that this system doesn't have to have an outside in the sense that Rosa Luxemburg demanded. it can be internalized, but it can only work if those three sources of energy in this system are actually working together in an efficient kind of way. And then the big question then is, well, what happens if it doesn't work in an efficient way? So let me give you a very explicit example, just so that you know what I'm talking about. And I apologize if some of you have seen this before. But, okay, let me go. I don't know where the other. Okay. I suggested that debt is an important source of energy in the system. And you see, this is all sectors, debt securities and loans in the United States from 1950 onwards. And you notice the neoliberal period, which is about sort of middle of the 70s, from 1980 onwards, what's happening to the debt? This is where the energy is coming from in the capitalist system. It sort of takes off. Notice, there's a hiccup in 2007, 2008. But did it actually decline thereafter? Oh no, it didn't. It quickly sort of jumped up. So here you have a situation where the debt is doing that, but you can now locate it, as it were, as, you know, what is going on is that we're getting more and more of the energy of the capitalist circulation process being provided by the circulation of interest-bearing capital. Now, this is China's overall debt. China has a crucial role, as we will see, in what happened after 2007, 2008. And you see that, oh my goodness, this is me. Okay. What you see is that the debt is increasing sort of at a certain kind of rate up to 2007, where it's 144% of GDP, which is pretty high. But then what happens in China is the debt goes soaring way, way, way up. To 2014, it's 245%. Now it's around nearly 300%. So there's a huge indebtedness going on in China. And it's not only indebtedness in government debt. And as you see, there's a breakdown of it, of corporate, government, and household. Household is only 24% of GDP, which is very low. But it is increasing very fast. Because so when you look at this here, this is by quarters from beginning of 2013 up until 2016. It starts off and it's around 32% in 2014 there. By the time you get to 2016, consumer debt is up to 41% of GDP, which means the households are borrowing a tremendous amount of money. And what are they doing with it? Why are they doing it? And so this is going on. Well, here's part of the answer. This is the consumption of cement in China compared to the United States. The blue line at the bottom is the consumption of cement in the United States over a 100-year period. The red bars is consumption of cement in China. Now, this is going to get us into questions of limits and what the hell's going on here, but China has been spreading a lot of cement around. I think you would agree with that. Now, but there's something very interesting. 2008, the point of crisis is here. Now, you would expect in a crisis, right, that everything would fall apart and there will be a recession of some kind and things would come to a stop. But what happens? You jump, wow, bang, 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 bang. Huge, huge increase in the consumption of cement after 2008. Now, what is cement used for? Well, it's used in construction. So what were the Chinese doing and why were they doing it? Well, let's go back and look at it in relationship to this graph again. What happened to China in 2008? And let's analyze it with the help of this, all right? This system is working extremely well. A lot of the realization of value in money form depends upon export to the United States. The export industries to the United States are absolutely foundational for the realization of value in Chinese industrial systems. In 2008, the consumer market in the United States crashes. All of those people producing in China, going through this and getting to this point, get the commodities, get it up to here, and they can't realize the value. In other words, there's a massive realization crisis because, you know, the US consumer market is effectively closed down. Foreclosed households don't go out on buying sprees. And unemployed people don't go out on buying. So it collapses. So all of the industries which are going through here, a lot of them go bankrupt. A lot of them just can't continue. They actually just started firing people left, right, and center. And factories were going under in Guangdong and Shenzhen and all the rest of it, and there were unemployed people emerging all over the place. And you know, Chinese statistics are terrible to work with, and so but the suggestion was that around 30 million people in China lost their jobs. Okay, well, there's one thing the Communist Party in China doesn't like. It's 30 million unemployed people milling around, getting very antsy and all the rest of it. There is a revolutionary tradition in China, and the Communist Party is very well aware of it, and there was a lot of discontent around it anyway, and so they know that this could be a catastrophe for them. All right? So what did they do? They said, oh, well, we have to revive somehow employment. How do we do it? Well, at the end of 2009, there was a detailed study of the net job losses through the crisis of 2007-2008. The United States lost around 14 million jobs. It was a very big thing. Well, no, that's maybe too much. Eight or I forget the exact number. China said the said the IMF and the ILO study lost a net job loss of 3 million. Well, that meant that somehow or other the Chinese had managed to employ 27 million people in 1 year, which is a huge thing to do. Well, what were they employed doing? Well, they were employed in completely reorganizing space, place, environment by a huge infrastructural program of investment, which is not hitting the problem of realization of value up here, but is simply dealing with producer-effective demand, but producer-effective demand about actually the reconstruction of the physical environment. They started building cities. They already had quite a few cities over 1 million, but they built another 10, in about 10 years. But then the question arose, where did the money come from to do that? Well, that's the debt graph you saw. And they had various vehicles. Part of it was the government. The government put in 2 shots of stimulus in 2009 and 2014. There was one thing that the central government did, which was to build the high-speed rail network, which, as I think I mentioned, had ended up with nearly 20,000 miles after 10 years. And of course, since the Chinese owned all the land, and anybody who was on the land got in the way of a high-speed rail network, then you're out, so no problem about private property rights in land, and so the Chinese could do this kind of thing. But the other thing was, it basically turned to all of the municipalities and all of the villages and all of everybody and said, build projects. And by 2000, and that goes back to this graph of this graph, you see that actually cement use has been zooming up quite a lot before 2008. And that had everything to do with the fact that China's growth path from the 1990s onwards was more and more about rapid urbanization. That China's urban population went from something like 170 million to something like 740 million in about 15 years. An astonishing rate of urbanization, but if you get that rate of urbanization, you've got to build something like 8 million housing units a year or something like that, and so there's this huge kind of program which is going on. And that is then the basis of, and in order to do that, they had to come up with new financing vehicles. Now, all the municipalities in China are barred from going into debt. So they formed, as it were, side financing groups called local government finance vehicles, which accounted by 2008 for about 2 or 3 trillion yuan in terms of investment, though nobody knows exactly what was in them and the like. But these local government investment vehicles, almost every municipality had one, almost every city had 2 or 3, and they were already engaging in all kinds of debt financing, and a lot of it was questionable. The central government would come in and say they'd try to control it because it was getting out of control. They were scared of bankruptcies and asset, bubbles and all this kind of stuff. But in 2008, the central government said, okay, we turn a blind eye, you do what you want. And the volume of indebtedness created in these local government investment vehicles went from something like 2 trillion yuan to something like 16 trillion yuan in about 4 or 5 years. Now this is all fictitious capital. This is all something that's being created somewhere else, and it's the energy which allowed China to completely rebuild its infrastructures. Highways all over the place. New water systems, sewage systems, buildings, new city centres, new kind of sports stadia and all the rest of it. And of course in 2008, it was already evident that that was what China was up to. China had the Olympic Games in 2008. It moved about 3 million people out of Beijing in order to redevelop Beijing in a way. It also, by the way, needed to make the air quality okay in Beijing, so it closed down all the factories for 2 or 3 weeks before the Olympic Games, so there was no air pollution. Which happened to me, by the way, because I arrived in Beijing last time, just around the time when the government was holding a big, massive international conference on the One Belt, One Road kind of thing. And all these international leaders were coming in, and the photo op was fantastic. There was beautiful blue sky. They were arriving in Beijing, and absolutely. I got into Beijing. I thought, what is all this talk about? Beijing is filthy polluted. Well, the answer was they closed the factories down for 2 weeks before the international conference because they didn't want the optics of them coming in with gas masks. So here's the thing. That China is doing this for a very, very specific reason, which is that it needed to deal with its realization crisis by switching the arena in which realization occurred from the export market in the United States to the internal physical infrastructure renewal and rebuilding and construction inside of China itself. And it was a huge, huge investment effort. And it was a huge, huge investment effort that had consequences for the rest of the world. For example, if you're building all these things, then there's a demand for raw materials, not only for cement, but for steel. And so what you see is things like this. This is world steel production. And you kind of see the world is kind of going along like this. The total world is doing that because China is doing that. Why is China doing that? Well, China's doing that because of this vast, vast investment project. So if you happen to be an iron ore producer, like Australia or Brazil or something like that, suddenly you find iron ore prices are shooting up because of the demand from China. Result is Brazil didn't have too much trouble getting out of the difficulties of 2007, 2008. Nor did Australia. Nor did Chile. Chile was producing a lot of the copper. And here's copper consumption by major regions. Look what's happening in China. Zoom. Globally, zoom. Everybody else fairly flat. China. China saved global capitalism by doing this. I mean, it's not as if the central government, the central party kind of sat there and said they felt they had to, save global capitalism. But it did. But it did it because it had to, because if it had not done that, it would have had 30 million unemployed. This development process with all that, since the 1990s, when I sort of figured that they created 27 million jobs in 1 year, I thought to myself, that is so astonishing. Until I actually read an account which says, well, actually China's been creating around 20 million jobs every year since around 1998, which is a phenomenal growth process, right? I mean, it's when you locate it back into that system, what you see is that the Chinese saw immediately they had to switch from one world to another world. And it's interesting. Is China's dependency upon the US consumer market going to revive as the US consumer market revives? I'm leaving aside all the sort of Trump nonsense, which is kind of not nonsense, it's actually very serious. But leaving that aside, but it turns out that China has figured that actually its internal market, which the IMF had been saying to it since around the year 2000, China, you need to expand your internal market. And of course, since 2007, 2008, that's what they've done. The first part of the internal market was the expansion of infrastructure investment. But then the problem is, if you're going to build all those housing, how are people going to buy them? Which is why that other thing on consumer debt and the rapid increase in consumer debt is very much about housing purchases. And they have to finance the purchases. They have to have a housing market. In 1995, China did not have a housing market. In 1995, they created one. And then they had to, as they created it, so they had to create financial institutions like mortgage institutions and all the rest of it, which are going to help people buy the housing. So again, the logic of the system is saying, well, the realization problem is there, but now it's switched. Now it's less and less about what goes on in the US market, and more about what's going on internally within the China market. But at the same time, China is getting to this point where it has surplus productive capacity. It has surplus productive capacity in cement and steel and all of these things. What is it going to do with its surplus productive capacity? It's got surplus funds, but until recently, most of those surplus funds were parked in US treasuries. And here comes a very interesting power relation. In 2007, 2008, three institutions in the United States were in very, very deep trouble. Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and AIG. Fannie Mae
and Freddie Mac are mortgage institutions. They're the ones who buy mortgages from the banks and then give the banks the liquidity. So the banks will originate a mortgage, not know what to do with it, don't want to hold it, pass it over to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and Fannie gives them the money and they can continue their business. So Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are huge institutions which are, in a sense, mortgage holding institutions, banks. In 2007, 2008, they were in a lot of trouble because a lot of the mortgages were not really worth the paper they were written on. AIG was a vast insurance company which was also insuring a lot of this stuff. It too was in grave difficulty. But they were private institutions and they had private bondholders. Who were the people who had all of their money invested in these institutions? Turned out 60% of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the bonds, were held by China and Russia alone. And Russia, that has no interest in the internal market, of course, in the United States, proposed to the Chinese that they should crash the whole US system by selling the whole lot. Bang, like that. In which case the US would have been in really, really, really dire straits. This was an incredible power, of course, that China and Russia were potentially wielding. But from the Chinese standpoint, it wasn't worth using it because that would certainly crash the US export market even more, and that was not to China's advantage. Russia didn't care about it because they're not connected to it. So China refused to do it. But as China starts to move to its own internal market, it becomes less and less dependent upon export market for realization. And as it becomes less and less dependent on the US, now the US is doing all of these things on, this trade and that trade, tariffs and all this kind of stuff. It's too late. It's far too late. It's crazy. I mean, it's insane, really, in terms of what's going on. It's not going to work at all. Because the Chinese are already on a path where they are actually internally, and this includes moving away from low-value production in terms of industrial structure to higher value and artificial intelligence and all the rest of it. And so they're moving into a different kind of economy anyway, and they're moving very fast. And I think in some ways what's happening with the Trump tariffs and all the rest of it is this is encouraging to move even faster into creating its own dynamic. And its own dynamic is no longer an internal dynamic. It's got surplus capital funds, and one of the arguments that I've been making over the years is to say when some country or some sort of economy gets surplus productive capacity, then the only way in which it can realize that surplus productive capacity is by what I call a spatial fix. You go outside. And that's a Luxembourg kind of argument. You go outside and pursue markets outside. And that pursuit of the spatial fix has now become absolutely central to what is going on in China. And here you can see certain elements of it. This is a map of Chinese foreign investment. You can't see it very well, sorry, in 2005. As you see, it's pretty spotty. There's a big chunk in Kazakhstan, there's nothing much else, there's kind of some stuff. Ecuador was a bit of a target, but at that time you wouldn't say that China was very active in the export of goods and services. This is 2013. I mean, we're talking about, 8 years, and here suddenly there's this huge expansion of Chinese foreign investment. This is the spatial fix in motion. And notice where it's going. It's going to raw material producers, a lot going to Australia, which is a major source of minerals and all the rest of it. A lot of it's going into Latin America, which the mineral producers like Chile, Ecuador, Brazil, and a lot of it is going into Africa, and of course some of it is going into the United States, but that's with the mission, as Trump realizes, to steal as much technological know-how as they possibly can by actually buying up firms and using their knowledge. It's always odd, though, to find the United States complaining about that, because that's how the United States got its knowledge in the 19th century. And by the way, who took all of the German scientists from Germany after World War II and took them to the United States and used all the secrets on rocketry to go to the moon? Well, you know, this has been going on for a while, but it's but if you looked at it now, it will be even greater. So the China question, when I think about it in relationship to the dynamics of that map, like who is producing and how is it being produced, and there's a dynamism to it, and you come back to the way in which this system is working. And so I always come back to this, my basic picture. This is an earlier one, by the way. It's not exactly the same as the one you've got, because I had a few small changes in it. But I found this very helpful to kind of say, look, where did this system get blocked in 2007, 2008, and where did it get blocked from the standpoint of China, and where did it get blocked from the standpoint elsewhere? In the United States, the problem was a realization crisis, a serious realization crisis. There was a movement within the field of distribution, within what I would call, let's put something in here, call it the state finance nexus, which is interest-bearing capital plus state power. The US Treasury plus the Federal Reserve, that they were trying to put stimulants into the economy. So they gave a lot of money to the banks and the financial institutions. And then they said to the banks and the financial institutions, all right, throw this into circulation and get the economy revived again, and it will revive again, and we will get people employed and all the rest of it. What did the banks do in the United States? They didn't do what they did in China. I mean, if you're a banker in China and the Central Committee tells you to lend and you don't, you're in real trouble. They gave all this money to the banks and said to the banks, lend, and the banks said, oh, thanks just for the money, we'll buy back our own stock. Or we'll just sit there with it. They didn't put it into circulation. And you know, from that point onwards, then the Republicans started to say, you can't do this because this is a debt. There's too much debt, and so we have to actually approach this by more austerity, which is to cut back on effective demand at the very moment when you want to release more effective demand. So the United States has had a hard time getting out of all of the difficulties of 2007, 2008. It's taken 10 years almost, simply because decisions were made in this thing which is going to restrict consumer effective demand. And it is still the case that to the degree that wage rates have not risen in the United States, and the share of wages in national income have not risen in the United States, that the effective demand problem in the United States is a very serious issue. The only form of effective demand which has been expanding has, of course, been government expenditures on military, which is a kind of form of military Keynesianism, which usually operates all the time in the United States. So we get some adjustments within this system. But when I have this picture in my mind and I'm reading the newspapers, I'm kind of going, yeah, okay, all right, now they're doing this. Now they're doing this, and they're trying to get... But this also has, I think, crucial kind of political question. Who's more powerful these days? The state apparatus or the bondholders? Wall Street or the US Treasury? Now, it's interesting, in the United States, Secretary of the Treasury, since the Clinton years, has nearly always come from Goldman Sachs, and has always done Wall Street's bidding. And there's this great moment when Clinton first came to power, and he was talking about his economic plans, and his economic advisor, who came from Goldman Sachs, called Robert Rubin, said, you can't do that. And Clinton said, why not? And he said, the bondholders won't let you. And Clinton famously replied, do you mean to say my whole economic program is held hostage to the views of a bunch of fucking bond traders? And Rubin said, yes. So Clinton came in promising universal health care, and he gave us NAFTA, reform he gave us a whole neoliberal program, which is mandated by Wall Street. I mean, it was like the International Monetary Fund doing a structural adjustment program, but it was internally engineered by Wall Street on the US people. So that's what the neoliberal stuff. Now, look at a country like Greece. Who's more powerful, the state or the bondholders? Well, it's obvious. It's the bondholders. Greece has to do what the bondholders say. In other words, where is power located in this system? Where is the central area of influence? And I'd like to argue our contemporary situation is one where actually the locus of power and the locus of everything that you really want to know about is really in this sphere of the generation of interest-bearing capital and the mobilization of interest-bearing capital and how it's being mobilized in the global economy by whom and in whose interest. And that therefore the other sources of energy are still there, but that they are, as it were, subsumed within, it seems to me, a logic which is now being impelled more and more and more out of this, what I call state finance nexus. And it is more and more about the power of the rentier. That is, if you hold funds in this system, and let's go back and imagine you're a banker, okay, and the Secretary of the Treasury and the Federal Reserve has just had that meeting with you in New York when they, in the wake of 2008 crash, and they said, okay, we give you $500 billion to you as a bank. What are you going to invest it in? Where would you send it? Well, I said, well, you should use it to buy back your own stock. What else do you do with it? Well, you might actually say to somebody, well, we want an adequate rate of return. One of the adequate rates of return is to invest in land or intellectual property rights. So, in fact, you don't go around this system at all. You find another path whereby you get more power. And you invest in assets. And actually, if you look at flows of international capital these days, people are investing in land, for example. There's something in the general colloquial term called land grabbing going on all around the world. And the land grabbing is people who have some extra money, and what do they want? They want security, so they buy land, or they buy what's on the land, or in the land, or under the land, i.e. resources. So there's huge amounts of land grabbing going on, and a lot of it has to do with surplus funds which are being expanded. In fact, a lot of that map of China's investments is land grabbing. A lot of it is, particularly in Africa, it's land grabbing, and it's procuring access to resources. It's not about investing and making something happen and improving the condition of the people. It's not about that at all. So you've got these dynamics which are going on. And what Marx does, just to come back to this in Volume 3, is frequently put himself in situations where he starts to see some of the craziness of this, but at the same time, some of the power of this and in the significance of this. At a certain point, for example, he starts to say, look, there are two kinds of capital in society. One is interest-bearing capital, and the other is industrial capital. And the path of interest-bearing capital is not the same. They are quite separate from each other. And what also happens and this is what I kind of like, is that Marx starts to see that this whole system is highly fetishized. So he'll give you phrases, okay? Give you a little quick. In interest-bearing capital, the capital relation reaches its most externalized and fetishized form, in which it appears, this automatic fetish, he says, is elaborated into its pure form, self-valorizing value. That is, value which creates its own value. And this automatic fetish is money that makes money in a way that no longer bears any marks of its origin. The social relation is consummated in the relationship of a thing, money, to itself. So he starts to talk further on in this chapter about the way in which the fetish character of capital and the representation of this capital fetish is now complete. Now this is interesting because the concept of fetishism is elaborated in the first chapter of Capital. And we know throughout that the fetish character of capital is constantly being reconfigured. And here is Marx saying that the financial system is the place where the irrational form of capital, the misrepresentation of objectification of the relations of production, that this capital fetish and the representation of it is now complete. And I think that that in itself is an interesting kind of way to say we're now living in this world in which the fetish is paramount. And he has some other wonderful kinds of comments, and I could trundle some of these out. But if you, for example, he clearly sees that the credit system is the principal lever of overproduction and excessive speculation. This is true in commerce, and this is simply because the reproduction process, which is elastic by nature, is now forced to its extreme limit. That is, credit pushes the thing to its extreme limit. And this is because a great part of social capital is applied by those who are not its owners. That is, the bankers in here don't necessarily own the capital, they're working with other people's money. And if they lose the money, it's the other people who lose the money. The bankers don't lose the money, other people lose their money. This only goes to show, says Marx, how the valorization of capital, founded on the antithetical character of capitalist production, permits the real free development of the productive forces only up to a certain point, which the credit system constantly breaks through. What kind of stresses come in the realm of valorization from this kind of huge impulse of credit flow, which demands that value be redeemed? Hence, a credit system accelerates the material development of the productive forces and the creation of the world market, which is up to a certain degree until the material foundations of the new mode of production have been established, that is, socialist system. At the same time, credit accelerates the violent outbreaks of these contradictions, crises, and with these the elements of dissolution of the old mode of production. The credit system, he says, has a dual character immanent in it. On the one hand, it develops the driving force of the capitalist mode of production, enrichment by the exploitation of other people's labor, into the purest and most colossal system of swindling and gambling, and the exploitation of social wealth by a few. On the other hand, it constitutes a form of transition towards a new mode of production, because it's undermining the whole valorization process. It is this dual character that gives the principal spokesman for credit, from Law through to Isaac Pereire, one of the bankers in Second Empire Paris, their nicely mixed character as both swindlers and prophets. I think it's a very good way to sort of start to think. So there's a lot of stuff goes on here with Marx making these kinds of commentaries, and I'm only just giving you a flavour of them, which are extremely insightful. And he talks at a certain point about how credit, when pushed to its limit, amounts to the abolition of the capitalist mode of production within the capitalist mode of production. And one of the questions, I think, which is on the agenda right now is, are we in the middle of this transition from a capitalist mode of production whose laws of motion we have understood because we've analyzed them very carefully, say, in terms of the volume 1 of Capital, even in terms of the volume 2 of Capital? Are we now, however, in a situation in which the volume 3 story, where Marx starts to see that these things are going in a very different direction, has become dominant? Well, clearly it has become dominant, and politically, the bondholders, in effect, control the utilization of political power, so that when Donald Trump did a reform of the tax law, who did it advantage? Well, the bondholders. It was beautifully crafted from their perspective, so that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And social inequality increases. So we can see some of these things. And I think it's a very, for me it was been extremely interesting to reread Marx's thinking about credit system without all of Engels' chapters in it. That is, to look at the flow of Marx's thought. And as you notice the flow of it, you see he's recognizing that certain things that held are giving way in the path of the credit system, but that the credit system is absolutely essential to the functioning of a capitalist mode of production. But that therefore we have to analyze the credit system very carefully. Okay, I've been talking enough, so let me throw it out to you. Yeah, that. Okay. No, I actually pointed to him, but you're next.
I was just wondering if you can talk a bit more about the structuring role of debt in the creation of money and circulation of capital, and if I know you don't exactly agree with David Graeber in a lot of stuff, and I also think in theoretical points he doesn't see the change that capitalism brings to the system, but I think he does point out how debt is structuring of money, and how it's not something new, how IOUs have been in circulation for a long time as means of exchange. So I don't know if you could just say something more on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think his account of how a lot of these things occurred historically is very good. I just think he doesn't understand the transformation that occurs with the rise of what I would call let me talk a little bit about the state-finance nexus and the crucial aspect of the state-finance nexus. I mean, here in London, it's really interesting. There is the City of London, which is an independent and autonomous entity, sort of, a square mile, which is where all the bankers and the merchants and so on wield their power. Now, how did that come about? Well, it came about because the British monarchy ran out of money. And it went to the wealthy merchants of the City of London and said, we need to borrow money. And the wealthy merchants of the City of London said, yeah, we will lend it to you, but only under certain conditions. And the conditions are that you charter a bank, which we will control, which will then lend you the money. So the Bank of England is formed in 1694, or whenever it was. And the Bank of England, you see, is not part of the state apparatus, but it is the pinnacle of the banking system. And it's controlled in the end by the bankers, even though, you know, the state can appoint the head of the Federal Reserve or whatever. So this then sets up, and then of course that gave the bondholders a certain power over the state, and that power has continued ever since. sometimes it's more powerful, sometimes it's not. One of the things that happened in the 1930s in the United States was the banking system and the credit system became so discredited that Roosevelt was able to sort of start to say, well, we're not going to listen to you. And then what happened was, in the Bretton Woods Agreement, the investment bankers were not really able to enter into the picture, so that gold continued to be the basis of the international system, which is something the investment bankers don't like because they want to be free to go beyond the barrier posed by gold. And as I mentioned last time, August 15th, 1971, Nixon says, okay, we're no longer on the gold standard. And after that, it's the decisions of the central banks and the Treasury. And the state finance nexus, it was very interesting when the crisis occurred of Lehman Brothers. Nobody in political power was to be seen. Everybody in Congress ran away and hid and said they didn't know what to do. The president didn't know what to do. The two people who knew what to do were the head of the Federal Reserve and the Secretary of the Treasury. And they came out on television and they had a piece of paper and they said, this is what we're going to do. And this is how we're going to solve the problem. And they took all the decisions. And this is the state finance nexus in action, visible. Usually the state finance nexus remains completely invisible because it doesn't want anybody. And I'm not saying the state finance nexus is always, there is conflict within it. But the whole debt system then hinges upon the state finance nexus. And that state finance nexus is essentially going to issue credit money. Not money, credit money. And credit money is different because money is simply a claim on value. Credit money is a claim that has to be repaid, in principle. And so when you issue credit money, you're actually creating a pool of, put it this way, a pool of claims which have to be redeemed. And have to be redeemed through value production. And this is, of course, Marx's point, that it has to be redeemed through value production. The problem right now is a lot of it is not being redeemed through value production. A lot of it is simply being covered by the issue of more credit money. So we get a Ponzi scheme in which credit money is used to redeem credit money, and so this year's credit money takes care of last year's debt. So, and what we're seeing in some of those graphs, the possibility to increase at that rate. And this is something that, is a challenge to, say, the Graeber type analysis. When you see the graph of total indebtedness in society, and you see in 1950 it's extremely low. It's there, but it's redeemed all the time. Then, of course, it starts to mount very dramatically, particularly since the 1970s. And that is what makes this situation very special. That credit monies are being created at a rate which is matching the requirements of the spiral form, but which cannot possibly be redeemed, and this is where this fetish character comes in, cannot possibly be redeemed given the way in which value production is reorganized, which means either that the value theory disappears and we simply monetize everything. And I think Marx thinks that is possible and points a little bit to that, except that he refused the idea that the gold material basis of a capitalist system could ever be overthrown. But since it's been overthrown since 1971, we have these other aspects of the dynamics of the system. For example, it's far easier now. I mean, when Marx talks about swindlers and prophets, and I talk about George Soros, and this is a very good example of somebody's a classic. If Marx was alive today, he would say somebody like George Soros has the classic thing: swindler and a prophet. He's always prophesying about things, and has a vision about the future, but he's a swindler. And they have this charming character. He has this charming character, as Marx says of Emile Ferrer, a swindler and prophet. Because they are manipulating a system that is about the pursuit of robbery and the pursuit of appropriation without necessarily contributing anything in terms of actual productive activity. So Graeber's not wrong when he talks about some aspects of that. I think what he's not doing is looking very carefully at the historical dynamic that sets in when state-finance nexus forms, when we have all of these institutional arrangements of the issuance of credit money as opposed to just money. And yeah, IOUs have been around a long time, but we didn't, in ancient Sumer, there was not a debt market in the way that there is right now, and you couldn't bet on currency futures and rate of exchange and weather futures and carbon trading and all kinds of other fetishistic markets which are created. You couldn't do that back then. So these are the things that are going on, which I think it's very important to look at through the eye of credit money. Yeah, sorry.
So this is kind of more of a request than a question, but I'd really love to hear more about the idea of alienation and the way that the social and psychic effects of that change as we move through these cycles. I don't know if that's too much of a ask.
Well, there is a paper in the Dropbox.
Yeah, well, that's why I read it, but I wanted to hear more about that.
All right. Okay. Yeah, I was leaving that a bit till tomorrow, but
okay. Well,
but I think this is a very good point to talk about. I mean, Marx's theory of alienation. It's interesting. It disappears in much of Capital. The one place it comes back, these passages in here, he specifically comes back and says it's not only, if you like, the high point of fetishism, this is the high point of alienation in the sense that we are subject to. So in the paper, one of the things I was talking about was the rise of what I call debt peonage. The fact that to the degree that we ourselves find ourselves indebted and we have to redeem those debts, and our lives are foreclosed. The lives of students are foreclosed around, foreclosure of a future around the fact you've got to pay off your debt. And there's a lot of evidence now that the behavior of those students who are heavily indebted is very different from those who are not. And some of the limitations are simply financial limitations. If you want to become a homeowner, you're not going to be able to get a mortgage if you haven't paid off your student debt. It's difficult to enter into, so all sorts of questions of that sort are involved. So one of the things that I think Marx does with the theory of alienation, particularly in the Grundrisse, is to start to talk about the way in which this system has certain laws of motion which none of us are in control of, but which have profound effects on all of us. I mean, nobody deliberately went in such a way as to create the crisis of 2007, 2008. But that had immediate effects in the fact that 7 million people or something like that lost their homes in the United States because they were foreclosed upon. Some of those foreclosures, it turns out, were illegal and unnecessary. So there was a huge transfer of asset values going on in US society as a result of that. And this also means that people were alienated from their means of shelter. With, of course, therefore, then the production of homelessness. We have 60,000 homeless people, I think, in New York City. Almost a third of the children in New York City are housed in technically homeless situations. Technically homeless, not in the sense that they're on the street, but a lot of them are couch surfing. You know, they'll be with a relative and they'll sleep on the couch, go to school, and they'll be with a relative for 3 weeks, and then they'll be somewhere else 3 weeks. So, you know, there's a lot of that sort of thing going on. And what this does is to create, so there are all sorts of aspects to alienation which partly derive from the ways of living which are emerging and the speed of transformation which is going on, but also the meaningfulness of jobs. Finding meaningful jobs, and you know, Graeber has his book on bullshit jobs, which I think is a very good piece of work, in which, you know, it's an interesting question when Marx kind of says to be a productive worker is a misfortune. It's an interesting question as to whether to have a job these days is a misfortune or not. I mean, some of the jobs are so deadly dull, and actually a lot of youth, as my casual observation, I mean, I know a bit about the barista world in New York City, and you know, people work in a coffee bar for 6 months and then say, oh, fuck this, and suddenly don't turn up for work. And they get enough money to live for 3 months, and then they go back and they find another coffee shop somewhere else. And so you suddenly find the person who served you in this coffee shop, you're in another one, and you say, oh, wait, how come you're here? Oh, well, you know, I got fed up with the other one, and I went to Florida and had a good time for 3 weeks, and now I come. So people have got used, as it were, to mining temporary labor possibilities in this kind of casual kind of way, which doesn't add any kind of solidity in society. It doesn't give any kind of the possibility of organizing. Then it's very hard and all the rest of it. But it's so yeah, alienation from the job, alienation from daily life, alienation from political processes, alienation which is actually structured through the requirements of dealing with credit card companies and telephone bills and, you know, all the rest of it. Just name it, you know. It's and I think we're living in a society where there's a huge kind of problem of alienation at all those levels. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Phil. I mean, this is a kind of a comment and a question. And I mean, I was just struck when listening to you speak about first last time about how credit provides the kind of temporal fix to the system, and then today about how credit kind of provides the energy of the outside to the system, to the capitalist system. And I was just struck by how both those roles at various times in kind of traditional Marxism, so to speak, was seen as being provided by the wage relation. So in Edward Thompson or whoever, you get this idea that the temporality of capitalism is fundamentally regulated by the wage system. And just thinking about what this means as a political, what the potential for the politicization of debt is, it seems to me that Marxism has had kind of two big searches for a political subject. First, in the kind of Lukácsian, the proletariat is the political subject, it comes out of the wage relation. And then what I would link to what you were saying about Rosa Luxemburg, the long phase really from the 50s, 60s onwards, where it's the outside, it's the colonial subject who might overthrow capitalism, which was a kind of hope that seemed to come from 68 stuff. And I was just kind of thinking through that and wondering, taking those two things together and what you were saying about debt and credit as the creation of an outside, whether there is some kind of potential for, I mean, people like Robert Dienst seem to think that there is, and David Graeber to an extent, the politicization of the debt relationship is where politics and the kind of the subject that might not overthrow capital but restrain it in some way might lie. And I wonder if you had any comments about what kind of politics can come out of debt as opposed to the other way around.
Well, what comes out of debt, it seems to me, is a struggle with the bondholders and the power of the bondholders. And I think there's a lot of naivete about dealing with debt on a local kind of basis or something of that kind. Right now, we've got huge concentrations of bondholder power in society. And you can see how that may be wielded and how it may be used. I don't think right now that we're going to see something which is, if you like, a revolutionary movement that's going to be able to confront that power, because actually the whole lubricant of the system is now debt-driven, and the organization of the debt, that state finance nexus, that is what in effect has to be dissolved. The central banks have to be dismantled and their power much reduced, but then that is going to be absolute reduction of the banking system from investment functions to purely retail functions. And actually there were some very interesting proposals at the 2007-2008 that said that the banks should be public utilities, and that they should not be, active investment agents. And I think the kind of transformation of the banks from what they're doing right now, investment functions and all the rest of it, to public utilities, is, as to some degree they were in the 1950s and 1960s. In other words, they weren't so active as they currently are. And of course there were specialist banks back in the 1950s, like workers' savings banks, building societies as they were called here, or savings and loan institutions in the United States, where local people who had surplus funds could put their money in the local thing, get a little bit of interest on it, and the money could be lent out to somebody who was buying a house, those kinds of things, which were actually communal. And could we actually restructure the financial system so that it was partitioned into, as it once was in the United States, into communal kind of retail and public utility sorts of functions, but that's all gone right now. They've become unified in which the banks themselves have acquired certain kind of power. So without the regulation of the banks and the banking industry and the radical reform of the banking industry, I think we're not going to be able to get very far in challenging the dynamics of this system. And I disagree, you see, with the idea that the wage relation now is what defines temporality. Because temporality, I think, again, is a multiple. And the temporality involved in the circulation of interest-bearing capital is in itself a different temporality from that which is defined by wage labor. Actually, a lot of the conflict which exists around the credit system is intra-capitalist. The industrialists against the banks. And to a degree that, for instance, in this country, ever since the rise of the City of London, government policy in this country has been oriented to support the City of London, and its policy over interest rates and all the rest of it had been fixed by the City of London, no matter what the impact was on industry. So a lot of deindustrialization in Britain had a lot to do with the way in which the state was favoring the financial institutions. But the state was favoring the financial institutions because the state was actually being taken over by the financial institutions. So it's an interesting kind of question right now as to what degree it's possible to acquire state power without actually, dismantling the power of the bondholders over financial, over state apparatuses. And that power is now pretty consolidated. And I think that is something that needs to be addressed. And you have to have a political movement that's going to do that and recognize that. Whereas right now, most political movements don't even want to know about that.
But do you think, I mean, I guess to kind of say it in another way, do you think debt non-repayment is a kind of political action that could be advocated? I mean, some people have kind of advocated a civil disobedience.
Well, there are
effectively.
certain kinds of debt that probably could be dealt with that way. The problem is if you abolish debt, you destroy my pension fund. See, I mean, seriously. I mean, what is my pension fund invested in?
Yeah.
It's invested in debt. And actually, everybody's pension fund is invested in debt. So, here again, you'd have to say, well, what gives the security of a livelihood to people in their old age, for example? In the United States, we have two systems. One is Social Security, which is a pay-as-you-go system where you are not invested in the stock market. The other is defined contributions to a stock fund, and that is invested in the stock market. So if the stock market crashes, I lose a lot of the value of my pension fund. Which, you know, it creates certain ambivalences. I see the stock market crashing down and I'm saying, yeah, end of capitalism, yay. And then I think, oh, Jesus, what about my pension fund? and there we are, but, you know, these are contradictions of the system and they're systemically there. But there are some that I think could be finessed and dealt with. It depends on what the target. I mean, in effect, my objection to what happened in 2007, 2008 was you had a problem in the housing market, and the banks were having difficulties because they had non-earning assets on their books, and nobody knew how to value the assets because the housing market had collapsed. So what did the state do? It supported the banks. But it should have supported the people in the housing, and then the banks wouldn't have had a problem. If it had said, okay, you know, you've got a mortgage of this amount, and we will cover it, we'll pay the gap between what you're getting and what, you know. In other words, if there'd been but that would have been a popular kind of thing to do, and it would have solved the problem of the banks, but it was do it via the people, instead of which the banks were saved and the people would, you know, lost their asset values. But that would have taken a lot of issue of credit. See, I mean, the only way the state could have done that is to create more credit. But the state was creating all that credit anyway. Instead of giving, you know, how many $1 million or $1 billion it gave to the 5 or 6 main banks, instead of doing that, you spent that $5 or $6 million or whatever it was on you know, restructuring people's mortgages. So you're going to have to find the money somewhere, and it's credit money, and it was credit money that was given. So then you have quantitative easing comes in, and you start to add more and more money and inject more and more liquidity into the system. And this is what I say when I say, you know, the only form of capital that can increase to that limit is money. It's the money form, and so when you're in a difficulty, you just print money. And that's what quantitative easing has been all about. And then the question is how is it being used, but it's being used for the benefit of the banks and, of course, for the oligarchy. That's who's benefited from it. Everything, all the data show that that's where the money went, and very little of it went to the mass of the people. And if it did, it went in such small drabs that actually, I mean, it was very interesting. The Bank of England did this study of the effects of quantitative easing, and came up with a conclusion that actually poor people benefited more than rich people, because the rate they, you know, of their improvement was I don't know, they improved their position by 8%, and the rich people only did it by 6% or something like that. And you're kind of thinking, oh yeah, okay, the poor benefited, and then it said so. The bottom 20% of the population received on average $3,000 or £3,000. The top 10% received £350,000. And you kind of go, oh, but the rate was higher. And actually, this is something it's interesting in Marx's chapter on the falling rate of profit. After talking about the falling rate of profit, you kind of start saying, well, actually, the capitalists might be more interested in the mass of profit. And the mass of profit went, of course, to the oligarchy. And they got the mass, even though they came up with this headline saying poor people benefited more than rich people because they got 7% more, but 7% of nothing is nothing. Whereas 7% of, $50 million is a hell of a lot of money. So it's interesting sort of, but so you need the money, and you need it to be distributed in certain kind of ways. And again, how it's distributed is, I think, very significant. But that's where political power decisions are made. And in a class society, you distribute the money in such a way as to benefit the ruling class. That's what neoliberalism has always been about, benefiting it's a ruling class project. But there are some things that could be dealt with by simple. I mean, I think it could be possibly done with student debt, for example. It could have been done more with housing. Yeah.
Thanks, David. Really insightful as ever. I was just thinking last week, Lewis Gordon put across the view that one of the problems with the left wing, as we conventionally understand it, is that it gets co-opted by subscribing to some notion of a single global market when we should be thinking in terms of markets, or some traditional conception of pre-capitalist markets where there were places for communication and real human exchange. I wonder whether you think that links with what you just talked about with regard to how people, I guess I'm talking about people like you and I, loosely speaking, who are academics trying to work on the left, get co-opted through our pensions into something that's not serving us very well. I mean, do we think outside that, or what do we do?
I think we think outside, yeah. You kind of go, look, if it became necessary to abolish pensions in the form that they're now there, then that would be contingent upon the replacement of pensions with a guaranteed income of some kind into the future, which would not be based on your contributions to some pension fund. I mean, Wall Street wants, I mean, again and again in the United States, we've had this thing about taking Social Security, which is a pay-as-you-go system, and converting it into something which is, and under the Bush administration, he put it as one of his big ambitions was to do away with Social Security, and of course they produce all this data that show that if you took all of your contributions to Social Security and you put them in the stock market in 1980, you would have been much, much better off today. But that was in 2005. They stopped talking about that in 2008 because it was exactly the opposite way around. But you see, Wall Street wants more and more control over more and more money power, and the creation of more money power and the creation of more markets, which are actually artificial markets, like carbon trading, weather futures, exchange traded funds. I mean, the number of innovative vehicles there are now, and forms of investing that there are now, just astonishing. And I think that we live in a society where a lot of people are dependent now on those forms. I don't think that academics are co-opted because of their pension funds. I think academics are co-opted by, unfortunately, some other means, which are how the way in which incentives are set up in terms of research and how you get positions in society, in academia, and how easy it is to be defined as a troublemaker who doesn't get a job, and all those kinds of things. So I think the disciplinary apparatus of academia those are more serious questions about the neoliberalization of academia and the corporatization of academia and the structuring of academic activity around the production of certain kinds of date indices and performativity and all this kind of thing.
I was at a conference, a development conference recently that was about big data.
Yeah.
And I'm not exaggerating, the keynote speech talked about political economy in terms of rules, and Ricardo and Marx was not even mentioned, the critique. And in latter talks, some of the talks were development academics advocating a positive social application of social media, being that people in refugee camps should have mobile phones, and this is what we should be fighting for.
Right.
It's just like, that's a co-optation if ever I...
Yeah. No, I mean, big data stuff is, and I've been battled with all this smart city stuff.
Yeah.
I think it'd be nice if they organised the traffic lights so that, they're better synchronised around the place. I mean, I think that's a good idea, but, the idea that this somehow or other is going to deal with mass alienation of a population, and that somehow or other everybody's going to feel happy because the traffic lights work a bit better, it's kind of insane. But all of the, this is what Google and everybody else is trying to do. And if you look what Google has done to San Francisco, and the consequences for San Francisco of Google being around, I mean, it's just it's destroyed the city. I mean, it's and I think the big data and media companies and all the rest of it are exercising tremendous negative power, I think, over the qualities of daily life, at the same time as they're swallowing up a vast amount of public investment in all kinds of these kind of big data-led organizational schemes. Okay, so we finished here. I think we should stop, and thank you, and we will be in it tomorrow.